So, and this kind of quiet that comes from a deep inner listening is what helps one to be in touch with the deeper, more subtle impulses, the spiritual impulses. They kind of reconnect you with a deeper sense of meaning, And that's why in most esoteric forms of spirituality, most inner forms of spirituality, there are various ways, and generally quite a bit of emphasis is placed on the capacity or the ability to be quiet, which, again, you could just substitute the word be quiet with the willingness and the ability to listen deeply. In fact, it may even be more useful to think of being quiet as actually deeply listening inwardly. Because if you think of even the word, the way the phrase be quiet, it almost sounds like a directive, and it's sort of the ego can think, okay, here's what I'm supposed to do. Now I'm supposed to be quiet. So you're kind of imposing an idea of quietness upon yourself. Which, if you've ever done that, and you probably have, if you're listening to this program, if you've ever done any kind of spiritual practice, chances of you trying to impose a kind of quiet upon yourself is probably quite great. You notice that it creates a kind of conflict. Because you're trying to impose, you're trying to make quietness happen in a sense. And when we try to make quietness happen, when we try to impose it, the very act of trying to impose it creates a kind of conflict at some level. The conflict may be overt, or it may be quite subtle. But however we do about it, it often comes off like a directive. Whereas when we endeavor to listen deeply, you don't get quite the same sense of that it's a directive. It's just like an invitation. And the mind would say, listen to what? Because it's so used to listening to some noise. If only the noise in your head. Or listening in terms of feeling, listening to whatever the surface emotion is at the moment. This is just our conditioned way of listening or paying attention. But actually it requires a deeper kind of listening. It's actually not a listening to all the thoughts in your head or listening to all the emotions you have, although you're not trying to exclude those either. It's actually kind of a listening, if you just listen to the quietness inside. If you've ever had that experience of trying to listen to a sound that you could barely hear, that was barely audible, that it was so barely audible that it kind of, you'd hear it and then you wouldn't, and then you'd hear it and then you don't, and then you hear it and then you don't, because it's just so much on the edge of being inaudible or unaudible. When you're listening to a really far-off sound like that, what you hear mostly is quiet. And when you listen in that way too, if you were to sense the spatial sense of that quiet, it's sensed as a kind of spaciousness. So when I'm mentioning listening, that's the kind of quality and of course, the gravitational pull is towards the noise. So anybody that's ever tried to meditate for very long has had the experience of endeavoring to listen at a deep level, and they notice what's competing with their listening to a real quiet place inside is all their internal noise, and the noise is very gravitational. The noise almost seems to be constantly drawing attention, almost begging for attention. And it's a kind of an art, actually, to find the capacity in yourself to listen to the quiet spaces, whether or not there is internal or external noise. Because all the noise, whether it's the noise outside of a car honking, or the wind in the trees, or someone in the next room, or the noise is internal in the sense of your thoughts, or the noise of whatever your current feeling state, or your emotional reactivity to whatever's happening. It's an art to kind of soften your attention around all the noise, to just be sort of soft and easy with it. When I teach meditation, I really describe this as simply letting everything in your experience be exactly as it is. By that I mean you just kind of soften your attention around it. You just allow it to be there. And the state of allowing itself is sort of softens attention. And your attention, simply by allowing something to be there, by allowing a sound or a thought or a feeling, by simply allowing it to exist and not being compelled by it and drawn into it, but neither are you reacting against it. But you're just allowing it to be, so it kind of softens your attention, softens awareness. And then there's a tremendous amount of awareness that just is available towards a deeper listening, a deeper kind of listening. Because this deeper listening is actually a way of responding to the spiritual impulse. You know, the reason that one is listening in this way, the reason that one is allowing things to be as they are, the reason that we're kind of softening our obsession with the content of awareness is simply because it makes attention available to the deeper draw of the spiritual impulse. Now attention is freed up. Now it can be drawn in by a draw that's much more subtle. You know, because noisy thoughts are not very subtle; they're actually very loud. Conflicted emotional states, internal dramas of who's to blame for what, and, you know, all the angst over the self-judgment and all of that. If you notice, all that's very loud, it's very insistent, and it has a very kind of ragged energy around all those kind of thoughts and psychological states. And like I said, it's not that you're trying to avoid them. Spiritual people try to do that too. They think they can deal with it simply by avoiding it, which you can't in the end really avoid something, not for very long. It'll always come back to find its completion. So it's not that you're avoiding it. There can be a part of your life that can be even dedicated to addressing all those kind of issues. The issues of the noise, I guess we might say. And simultaneously, the deeper spiritual draw is actually to be able to soften around that, or to deal with it in some way enough so that you can soften around it. Because sometimes people have personal issues that they're so conflicted or so unresolved that they literally can't really listen, because they need to have some level of resolution. So they need to give some attention sometimes to the conflicted thinking patterns and all the rest to find a deeper sense of resolution, at least enough to where there can be a kind of softening of attention, softening awareness around them. And so you have to kind of be honest with yourself, have the capability to be honest with yourself of what needs attention. When you begin to listen inside, and when I say listen, I'm just using that as a particular word. It's also a kind of sensing too. So you're listening and intuitively sensing. It's almost like you're sensing something intuitively that's not, at least certainly at the beginning, that's not particularly obvious. You're just sensing that draw inward. It's almost like a draw inward and downward, in a way, to the ground of your being, the seat of your being, the seat of your soul. And it's literally kind of being drawn in. There's not necessarily a particular really obvious object that draws you in, however. It's not like somebody goes inside of you and turns on a flashlight and says, "Here, this way," to the inner part of your being. It's sort of more an intuitive thing. It's, in a sense, it's almost like, if you thought of the example of, which is actually, I think, quite apt, or a lot of what goes on in the human realm is just really could be boiled down to a bunch of treading water. If you're treading water on top of a lake or something, and you're just splashing about and trying to do anything you can to make sure that you never sink below the surface. And on the surface, there's lots of people thrashing about, and there's lots of thrashing about, so it all seems very compelling. And, there can be, if you just learned how to swim just right, then all this thrashing about would stop. But you certainly, at a certain point, you kind of realize that that's what happens on the surface here. They're simply thrashing about, and pretty much everybody is they're treading water. They're doing whatever they can do to make sure that they stay, their attention stays very much on the surface. They may at times look inside in a deeper way, but they still very much want to keep their head above water. Whereas a spiritual impulse is kind of when you just realize the repetitive pattern of all that, and you just sort of stop treading water. And really, if you stop treading water in your own way, say psychologically, if you just stop fighting against yourself, fighting against the world, fighting against life, fighting against death, treading water so you just stay on the surface of all of it, if you just kind of stop fighting, then you just start to sink. In other words, it's a way of saying you start to go within. There is this sort of more subtle gravitational pull. This gravitational pull of spirit is much more subtle. It's much less insistent than the gravitational pull of all the splashing about on the surface. That's very insistent and very loud and very noisy. The spiritual impulse is not so dramatic as that in general. Although at times it can sort of pull you in a very visceral and deep way. Even though it can do that at times in general, it's something much more subtle. And that's sort of, I just want to paint that picture because I often do think that it's important that spirituality actually makes a kind of sense, even though it's, we have to go beyond just our intellectual understanding of all this. But to have a kind of clear understanding, I think, is important because it allows something inside, once it kind of understands, to let go more. Because you're not just letting go into some belief or some fantasy or with just some sort of random hope that everything works out, but that you realize there's a certain kind of wisdom. There's a certain wisdom to it. There's even a kind of rationality to the whole of spirituality. In fact, I think spirituality, even though it goes beyond rationality, it should actually also be quite rational. It should really make sense to us. Once you understand this, then you're more sensitive towards the way that you can be hijacked from that impulse, from the really deeply going to the roots of your being. And when you really go into the roots of your being, you're actually going to the roots even of all the turmoil, because all that turmoil on the surface actually has its roots way down at the core, at the bottom of the ground of your being. That's way down at the ground is where the confusions start. They start at a place that's far beyond your conscious mind, far beyond your conscious understanding. They have their roots way down in something much, much deeper. And if you can never get deeper than the surface, then you can only help yourself so much. You can always, all you can do, it's almost like just pruning the bushes of suffering rather than getting to the root of it. And so, at least in my mind, this all kind of ties into an email that I got. And I'm not going to read the whole email, but there's this one sentence in here that I think is also one of these things that's sort of very universal. And it says what they were talking about earlier in the email. This seems to touch a fundamental sense of anxiety and restlessness that I find incredibly difficult to stay with. And it really caught my attention, this fundamental sense of anxiety and restlessness. I think if anything sort of designates the experience of a separated and isolated self, it is the experience of a kind of fundamental sense of anxiety and restlessness. That's experienced differently in different people. But you see it all the time. It's almost like the egoic sense of separate self. It can't stop for very long. It doesn't stop for very long. It's just part of human beings. It's constantly on the move. And at times you might even wonder, where is everybody going? Where does everybody think they're getting to? It's like everybody's rushing around as if they're going to get somewhere. And they're rushing around, in their outward lives, run here to there. They're rushing constantly in a state of sort of, anxiety and just a sort of fundamental restlessness it's like this great rush, this that's fueled by this kind of anxiety, as if all this rushing around is actually getting anybody anywhere. It's in one sense, it's horrific. It can have some very horrific consequences. And in another sense, it's sort of absurdly funny. It kind of has both of those qualities to it. The horrific part can, of course, end in violence and chaos and hate and envy and greed and, all the other sort of conflicted ways the ego tries to find fulfillment and satisfaction. The absurdity, the humorous part of it is just sort of seeing that, as human beings, we're often running about internally and externally all over the place, literally just even in a rush, even when you don't need to be in a rush, instantly angling for the fastest lane on the freeway, even though you've got all day to get somewhere. There's often this constant moving about. And you wonder, where does everybody think they're getting to? Where are we going? does this ever actually get us to where it promises to? Because I think a lot of this sort of psychological rushing about, there's sort of underneath of it is a sort of hidden promise that I rush about because at some point I'll arrive somewhere. I'll get there, wherever there is, but I'll get there. And I have to keep internally rushing about in an anxious way. I have to have this sort of anxious relationship with myself, this sort of angst-driven relationship, so that I arrive somewhere, wherever that is, but I can arrive at this place where I will no longer have to rush about. And sometimes if we get really addicted to sort of an endless self-improvement process, even though self-improvement to a certain extent is perfectly fine and worthy, but if it goes beyond a certain point, it's like I'm going to keep improving myself so that at some point what? Have you ever asked yourself, like, where am I going? What endpoint do I imagine that I'm going to achieve? Do I really imagine that I'm going to become such a perfect person that I will have absolutely nothing to improve upon? Do you actually think you're really going to get there? Do you know anybody that actually has arrived there? You see, and if we don't really ask these kind of questions, this sort of rushing about and constantly treading water on the surface of life, all the time kind of driven by this feeling that I'm going to get somewhere, I'm going to get to this place where I'll really be satisfied someday, where I really will feel whole and complete, that all this rushing about is going to pay off in a sense of well-being at some point. But at a certain point, you realize that it's not really paying off. One rush leads to another rush, leads to another rush, leads to another rush, and it just sort of never ends. You resolve one thing only to have another thing to resolve, and then another thing, and then another thing, and another thing, which only leads way to another thing to resolve, and so it goes. And at some point, it seems that one would have to start to scratch their head and go, where is all this getting me? Where am I going? Where is this supposed place of rest and ease and well-being and connectedness that I imagine that all my rushing about is going to get me? Does anybody ever get there? Or are we simply comfortable on the path of our rushing about simply because everybody else seems to be doing it, and we don't seem to know how to do anything else? In other words, what legitimizes the path of rushing about and this constant search for happiness and self-improvement, what legitimizes it, or seems to legitimize it, that at some point we actually arrive where we hope we won't have to do this anymore. And it's legitimized in large part because almost everybody else is doing it. So what legitimizes it is simply numbers. The vast majority of human beings on the face of the earth are doing this. Therefore, it must be legitimate. It can't be. I mean, wouldn't it be embarrassing if we all found out that it was completely absurd to a certain extent? That nobody was really getting anywhere with it all. Where is it leading, after all? So don't misunderstand me, like I said earlier. Perfectly aware that is very much a time and a place for a certain kind of self-improvement. I'm not against self-improvement. I know some spiritual teachers are against any kind of effort toward self-improvement. I'm not one of them. I think there's a, legitimate time and place for such things. But if that occupies, if we really think that that in itself and that alone is going to get us to a place of arrival, in other words, to a place where we don't no longer feel this constant and restless drive that has at its very roots a feeling of sort of unsatisfactoriness, this feeling of kind of alienation from ourselves, others, and the world around us, I think we're kind of deluding ourselves.